If you can play that instrument, I'll marry you." Victoria Whitmore tossed out the declaration, but Elliot Reed didn't even look up. "Did you hear me?" The man finally looked at her, his eyes holding a strange, unreadable quality. He slowly rose, one hand still resting lightly on the piano bench. "I heard you," he said, his voice calm, "but that isn't a piece to be played on a dare." The brazen challenge, as it happened, had stemmed from a ridiculous mishap just moments before. Elliot had been scrambling to pick up a dropped glass. He was just straightening up as Victoria turned from posing for the cameras, her arms swinging in a graceful arc. The unfortunate timing sent the champagne sloshing, splashing a golden streak across the pristine white silk of her gown. The room held a collective breath for a second. Then, all attention snapped back to them, curious gazes converging, phones rising to capture the moment. "What the hell are you doing?" Victoria's voice shattered, sharp as glass. Elliot placed the glass on a tray, drew himself up, and held his hands out in a placating gesture. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. Sorry," she cut him off. "You've stained this gown. Do you have any idea what it costs?" Victoria's question required no answer. It was a declaration of power, drawing an invisible line between the one entitled to make demands and the one expected to bow their head. A businessman scoffed. A man in his position couldn't afford a single scratch on that gown. A ripple of supportive laughter spread, and another voice added, loud enough for everyone to hear, "People like you belong in the back." A security guard moved closer, not as a threat, but as a silent period at the end of an unvoiced sentence of guilt. Elliot's voice remained even. "I can cover the dry cleaning bill, ma'am." He knew how hollow the offer sounded. A month of his wages likely wouldn't cover the bill from such a high-end establishment. For Victoria, the exhaustion of living in a glass cage of expectations had morphed into a single reflex: reclaim control. She pivoted, drawing every eye back to her, transforming the incident into a spectacle. Or, how about this? Her voice rang out, cold and cutting. She pointed to a violin resting on the dais. "If you can play that violin better than my own virtuoso, I will marry you." The room fell silent for a beat, then erupted into a cacophony of murmurs and laughter. Someone quipped, "Careful now. I'd wager his hands are more familiar with a broom than a bow." A few half-hearted shushes could be heard, but they did little to dim the amused glint in the surrounding eyes. The derisive joke was cushioned by laughter, a convenient buffer that saved anyone from having to name its naked contempt. On the edge of the crowd, an elderly guest clutched her purse. Her gaze shifted from Elliot to Victoria, and she recognized the look of someone who had never had to question their right to exist in a space. "It's just an accident. There's no need to make a scene," someone whispered, but the phone in their hand remained raised, ready to record. Ordinarily, Elliot would have quietly retreated into the service corridor, making himself invisible to let the storm pass. But tonight, something inside him refused to bow. "I don't need you to marry me," Elliot said, his voice low and firm, his gaze locked on Victoria. "I only ask that if I succeed, you honor your word." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd, as if testing the sincerity of his seriousness. Victoria raised an eyebrow, trying to wrestle the narrative back under her control. "Oh, wonderful. Then by all means, show us, my friend." She drew out the words "my friend" with thinly veiled scorn, another way to avoid using his name. "Place your bets." A guest shouted, and the atmosphere instantly turned electric. 500 Sasha gets through the piece. 500 Sasha gets through the piece. 1000 says he doesn't snap the bow. Cash materialized, bills passing from hand to hand in a frenzy of brazen excitement. They were cheering for a public humiliation without having to acknowledge their own cruelty. The PR handler shot Victoria a look, a flicker of a frown that was quickly replaced by a professional smile. This clip, if handled correctly, could become a viral storm. In Victoria's mind, charts of public sentiment Media reach and potential headlines were already scrolling by. She was so used to measuring everything in metrics that she had forgotten how to measure the worth of a human being. Elliot shook his head as the money was offered to him. "I'm not taking your money." "Then what do you want?" "Just one thing," he repeated, his eyes never leaving Victoria. "If I win, you acknowledge your promise in front of everyone here." A brief hush fell. Victoria laughed, more confident this time, certain she was still in complete control of the game. "You have a deal, and plenty of witnesses." She jutted her chin toward the stage. "That violin is waiting. The whole city is watching." A security guard trailed him, escorting a walking liability. In a corner, the music critic David Chen observed silently, curious to see how an arrogant dare could rewrite a man's life. He looked at the violin, then at Elliot, and a flicker of keen anticipation lit his eyes. "Come on," someone urged, their voice thin as a razor's edge. "Try not to make it sound like you're strangling a cat." The laughter erupted again, louder this time, but colder than ever. Elliot stepped onto the stage. The snickering in the crowd hadn't yet died down. "Hurry it up. It's almost past your curfew," a man yelled from the bar. Victoria crossed her arms, a smile still fixed on her face, but a knot of irritation began to form in her stomach. "Just end this farce," she thought. He lifted the violin, and suddenly the entire room fell silent. Not by command, but because of an inexplicable shift in the air. His back straightened, the subservient posture vanishing, replaced by a stance that belonged only to the masters. The PR handler leaned into Victoria's ear, whispering, "He doesn't exactly look like an amateur." Victoria didn't reply, her eyes glued to Elliot's fingers as they settled on the fingerboard. And then he drew the bow. The first note sliced through the suffocating air. It was painful, pure, and cruelly beautiful. "My God," a woman in the front row breathed. The smile on Victoria's lips froze, then shattered. This was not the sound of a novice. This was the sound of a soul crying out. Elliot closed his eyes, and the music began to tell its story. A story of loss, of despair, and of a love so resilient it could burn down the world. In a corner of the room, the critic David Chen, who had been watching in silence, suddenly gripped the arm of his companion. "Impossible," he murmured, his voice thick with disbelief. "That phrasing, I've only ever heard it from one person." The music swelled to its crescendo, a storm of emotion that tightened its grip on Victoria's chest. It was the kind of raw, naked music her father had once told her she was unworthy of. She felt her carefully constructed defenses crumbling piece by piece. When the final note faded into the air, no one clapped. They didn't dare. The silence that followed was heavy, almost sacred. Elliot opened his eyes, his breathing heavy. He gave a slight bow to the instrument, then turned to leave. It was then that David Chen shot to his feet. His voice, clear and trembling, cut through the murmurs. "E. Reed." The name detonated in the room like a bomb. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. E. Reed, the violin prodigy who had vanished from the height of his fame a decade ago without a word of explanation. The PR handler turned to Victoria, her face ashen. "Victoria, that's E. Reed. It's him." Victoria stood frozen on the floor, the applause that finally erupted sounding like it was from another world. She couldn't tear her eyes from Elliot's back as he walked quietly off the stage, as if he had just finished a simple cleaning job, not set the entire room ablaze. E. Reed. The name echoed in her mind, a refrain of disbelief and astonishment. David Chen, the music critic, was advancing on her, his eyes blazing. "Victoria, do you have any idea who you've just found? That's E. Reed, in the flesh. Where have you been hiding him all this time?" Other guests began to crowd around, their phones still pointed at her and Elliot, but now their expressions held not mockery, but stunned disbelief. "Miss Whitmore, what is going on? Is he really E. Reed?" Victoria's head was reeling. She needed information. She needed control. She motioned to her PR handler, who was standing beside her, still ashen-faced. "Get my phone," she commanded, her voice sharp, trying to master the chaos churning inside her. "Open the browser, search violinist E. Reed." Her handler complied, her hands shaking. A few seconds later, she handed the phone to Victoria. The screen lit up with a flood of results. Victoria scanned the headlines. The lost legend. Where has E. Reed been for 10 years? A modern-day Mozart. A look back at the meteoric career of E. Reed. She tapped on an image link. A gallery of photos appeared. A young man with a fuller head of hair, standing on the world's greatest stages, the violin in his hands looking like an extension of his own body. The face was younger, thinner, but the eyes. Victoria zoomed in on an old portrait. Those strange, grey-blue eyes. The same eyes that had watched her so calmly as she'd thrown down her arrogant challenge. Unmistakable. She looked up, her gaze finding Elliot. He was at the edge of the crowd, about to slip into the service corridor, trying to become a ghost again. But it was too late. Every eye in the room was now fixed on him, no longer the gaze one gives a janitor, but the one reserved for a living legend. "Arthur," Victoria called, and her head of security was instantly at her side. "Stop him," she commanded, her voice having regained its customary authority. "Don't let him leave this building." Arthur nodded and signaled to 2 other guards. They moved quickly, not to apprehend him, but to form a polite cordon around Elliot, cutting off his exit. Victoria took a deep breath, pushing all the chaotic emotions aside. This was no longer a personal incident. This was a Lyra Records event. She strode toward Elliot, the crowd parting for her like the Red Sea. She stopped directly in front of him. The room held its breath. "E. Reed," she said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. "That's your real name, isn't it?" Elliot didn't flinch from her gaze. He simply looked at her, and in his eyes, Victoria saw a profound weariness, the exhaustion of a man whose long-held secret had finally been dragged into the light. His silence was the only answer needed. The whispers in the crowd swelled into a collective roar of astonishment. Camera flashes went off like strobes. Victoria knew she had to seize control of the narrative. Immediately, she turned to Arthur, her head of security. "Take him to my office," she ordered, her voice cutting through the noise like ice. "And ensure we are not followed." The long corridor to her private elevator had never felt so fraught with tension. The sharp click of her heels on the marble floor was the only sound breaking the suffocating silence. When the elevator doors closed, sealing them off from the clamoring world outside, there were only the 3 of them and Arthur. Elliot stood motionless in the corner, his eyes fixed on the floor. The office door swung open. Arthur held it politely. "You stay outside," Victoria told Arthur, then looked at Elliot. "Get in." Inside the lavish penthouse office, the silence was almost unbreathable. City lights glittered beyond the windows, indifferent to the drama unfolding within. Elliot stood there, in his janitor's uniform, looking utterly out of place amidst the wood-paneled walls and platinum records. Victoria slammed the door shut. She didn't take her CEO's chair. She stood facing him, the few feet between them feeling like a decade. 10 years, she began, her voice tight with an unnameable rage. "You threw away Carnegie Hall, multi-million-dollar recording contracts, a career people would kill for, to come here and mop my floors. Why?" Elliot didn't flinch. He just looked at her, his grey-blue eyes eerily calm. "Because the world wanted E. Reed," he said, his voice low and weary. "But my daughter, Luna, she just needed her dad." Victoria froze. "A daughter? She's sick," Elliot continued, each word a weight being set down. "A rare genetic disorder. The doctors said she wouldn't live past her teens. For those years, she didn't need a famous father who was always on the road. She needed someone to be there, to read her stories, to hold her hand when she was in the hospital." He took a deep breath. "I couldn't let her illness become some tragic headline. I couldn't have paparazzi camping outside the hospital. I couldn't let people pity her. She deserved a peaceful life. So, E. Reed had to die, so Elliot Reed could be a father. The truth hit Victoria with the force of a physical blow. All the arrogance, all the anger, drained out of her, leaving only a hollow shock. He had given up the entire world for his own small one. But why Lyra Records? She asked softly, the last question that remained. Why here? A sad smile touched Elliot's lips. Maybe because I'm a fool, I couldn't play anymore, but I couldn't live without the music either. Here, at least, I could still hear it, like a ghost haunting his own house. Elliot's confession hung in the air, and the silence in Victoria's office was heavier than the media storm raging outside. He wasn't a liar, nor was he a fame-seeker. He was a father. Victoria arranged a secure exit for Elliot through a back entrance, sparing him the horde of reporters. For the next 2 days, she faced the earthquake alone. She issued press releases, handled the board of directors, and fielded furious calls. Through it all, she wondered why Elliot remained silent. He had every reason to expose her arrogance, to spin the story to his advantage. But he hadn't. On the third night, long after the building had fallen into silence, Victoria found him. He wasn't in the concert hall, but in the company's instrument storage room, where forgotten instruments gathered a thin layer of dust. He was gently polishing an old violin, the gesture full of reverence. There were no cameras, no microphones, just the two of them, and the silent ghosts of music. "Thank you," Victoria said, her voice echoing in the quiet room. Elliot looked up, not entirely surprised. "I told you, I didn't do it for you." "I know," she replied, stepping closer, "but I still wanted to say it. You could have turned me into a social media punchline. You didn't." He set down the polishing cloth. What would be the point? The world has enough punchlines. They stood in silence for a moment. Victoria's gaze drifted over the abandoned instruments. "I used to have one like this," she said suddenly, her voice softening. "A violin." Elliot simply listened, giving her the space to continue. "My father was a conductor," she began, her eyes distant. "I lived and breathed music just to make him proud. When I was 17, I played a Bach concerto for him. I thought it was the most perfect performance of my life." She took a shaky breath, fighting to keep her voice steady. When I finished, he just looked at me and said, "Victoria, you have the technique, but you have no soul. You should only play when you have something worth hearing." The sting of that memory was still as fresh as yesterday. The next day, I put my violin in its case and never opened it again. I built all of this, she gestured around her, just to prove I was worth hearing, even without that damn instrument. Elliot didn't offer platitudes. He just nodded, a deep understanding in his eyes. "So we're both ghosts then," he said softly, "haunted by the music we can't touch." That shared recognition broke down any remaining walls. The next night, and for many nights after, they began to meet in the grand concert hall after all the employees had gone home. Victoria found an old violin from the archives, the very one Elliot had been polishing. At first, her fingers were stiff, clumsy. The sounds she made were jarring and uncertain. Elliot didn't judge, he just played with her. They didn't play perfect concertos. They played improvised melodies, fragments of unfinished pieces. Their music was filled with flawed notes and hesitant pauses, but it was honest. It was the sound of two souls learning to speak again in a language they had both abandoned. It was healing, raw, and beautiful. A week later, Elliot invited her to his home. "Luna wants to meet you," he said, a rare smile touching his lips. "She calls you Queen Victoria." His apartment was in a modest building, small but clean and warm. And there, she met Luna, a thin, pale girl with wide, clear eyes that were the mirror of her father's. She was sitting up in bed, surrounded by books and art supplies. What made Victoria stop short was the wall opposite Luna's bed. It was decorated with colorful paper cutouts of musical notes, and in the very center was a hand-drawn picture. It depicted a woman in a magnificent red gown, standing on a stage, a crown on her head. Beneath it were the words, "Queen Victoria." "Hello, Your Majesty," Luna said, her voice like tiny bells. "Does my picture look like you?" Victoria was speechless. She could only nod. "My dad says you're the one who made him play again," the little girl continued, her gaze full of trust. "Since you came, the music is back in our house. My dad, he feels alive again." And in that moment, Victoria understood. The music they made at night in the empty concert hall wasn't just for healing two broken souls. It was a lifeline. It was hope. It was life for this little girl. It was bringing Luna's real father home. Victoria's heart, frozen for so long, began to thaw. The warmth of her meeting with Luna lingered with Victoria for days. For the first time in years, her work wasn't the only thing that filled her mind. The nightly music sessions with Elliot had become a sanctuary, a beautiful secret that belonged only to them. But in the modern world, secrets are a luxury. The storm broke on a Tuesday morning. Her PR head, Jenna, burst into the office, her face drained of all color. She said nothing, just held out her phone to Victoria. On the screen was a video, grainy footage, shot from an unknown security camera angle. In the dim light of the empty concert hall, the images of her and Elliot were unmistakable. They were sitting close, heads bent together, violins on their shoulders. There was no sound, but the intimacy was undeniable. It wasn't a performance. It was a private, tender, wordless conversation. Below it, the sensational headline, "Lyra Records CO in secret affair with the janitor genius." The video had become a digital wildfire. The hashtag number Queen and the Vagabond was trending. Public opinion was split. One side spun a fairy tale romance. The other, more cynical side, called it a calculated PR stunt or, worse, a sordid scandal. Lyra Records stock began to tremble. Victoria's phone rang. It was Sir Sterling, the chairman of the board. His voice was cold as steel. "Board meeting. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Have an explanation ready, Victoria, and a solution." The meeting took place in the lavish boardroom, where the wood-paneled walls seemed to absorb all warmth. The 12 most powerful faces in the company stared at her, their expressions a mixture of concern and judgment. Sir Sterling wasted no time. "Victoria, we've assessed the damage," he began, placing a folder on the table. "This personal entanglement of yours is affecting investor confidence. The Lyra Records brand is being damaged." He pushed a sheet of paper toward her. It was a pre-written press release. "Here is the solution. We will announce that Lyra Records has officially signed E. Reed. The late-night meetings were professional practice sessions. All rumors of a personal relationship are unfounded and false. You will sign it, read it to the press, and this crisis will be over." It was the perfect exit. A clean, polished lie. It was what the old Victoria Whitmore would have done. She would sacrifice a pawn to protect her queen, extinguish the fire at any cost to save her empire. She looked at the faces around the table. They didn't care about the music, or Elliot, or her. They only cared about the numbers on the stock ticker. Then she thought of Elliot, who gave up the world for his daughter. She thought of Luna and her drawing of Queen Victoria. She thought of the feeling of playing a single note for the first time in 15 years, not to prove a point, but simply because she wanted to. Was a life built on polished lies worth living? Victoria took a deep breath. She gently pushed the press release back towards Sir Sterling. "No," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it resonated through the silent room. "I won't sign it." Sir Sterling's brow furrowed. "Victoria, don't be a fool." "A fool?" she repeated, and for the first time, a genuine, undefended smile touched her lips. "Gentlemen, for years, I ran this company with my head, with numbers and strategies. I made Lyra Records a titan. But I, myself, was empty. She rose to her feet, her gaze meeting each person's directly. I will not stand before the world and lie. That rumor is not a rumor. She paused, letting her words sink in. My relationship with Elliot Reed is real, and the music you saw in that video, it isn't a commercial product. It's what saved me. It brought me back to myself in a way no record deal or platinum award ever could. The boardroom was stunned into silence. Sir Sterling looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "Victoria," he snarled, "do you have any idea what you're throwing away?" "I do," she replied, her voice now calm and certain. "I am trading a gilded cage for my freedom. Lyra Records is my legacy, but it will no longer be my prison." With that, she turned and walked out of the boardroom, leaving behind 12 stunned executives and an empire on the verge of change. For the first time in her life, Victoria Whitmore didn't know what tomorrow would bring, and she felt strangely at peace. Victoria walked out of the boardroom, but she didn't feel defeated. She felt light, as if she had just shed a suit of armor she hadn't even known she was wearing for the past 15 years. She didn't go back to her office. She didn't call her lawyer. She just drove, and unconsciously, the car led her to the familiar street where Elliot lived. He opened the door, his face etched with worry. News travels at the speed of social media. "I saw," he said softly, his voice full of concern. "The meeting, Victoria. What did you do?" Victoria looked directly into his eyes, a gentle and genuine smile appearing for the first time. "I chose our music," she said simply. Just as that moment of understanding sparked between them, Elliot's phone rang. He glanced at the screen, and his world shattered. "The hospital," he managed to choke out, his voice breaking. "It's Luna." The hospital air was cold and reeked of antiseptic. Elliot sat motionless in the waiting area, his broad shoulders now slumped in helplessness. Victoria realized this was a world where her power and money were almost meaningless, but almost wasn't entirely. She couldn't cure Luna, but she could fight for her. Call after call was made, not with the tone of a CEO, but of someone pleading for help. She called in every favor, leveraged every bit of prestige she had built over a lifetime not to close a deal, but to ensure Luna had the best care possible. When they were finally allowed to see her, Luna was asleep, small and fragile amidst the blinking monitors. Elliot sat by the bed, taking his daughter's hand, as if it were the only thing anchoring him to reality. Victoria pulled a chair close. Words felt hollow. She thought back to their nights in the concert hall, and she began to hum, a simple, old lullaby. Her voice wasn't perfect, but it was warm and sincere. Elliot looked up, and as if by instinct, he took out the violin he always carried in its case and gently drew the bow, his notes weaving around her melody. Their music wasn't a performance. It was a prayer, an invisible embrace surrounding the little girl. They played until the first rays of dawn slipped through the blinds, and they saw Luna's heartbeat on the monitor seem to steady just a little. The following days were a series of quiet moments at the hospital. They sat together for hours, sometimes talking, sometimes in silence. During one visit to the hospital's bleak cafeteria, Victoria looked at Elliot, who was wearily stirring his coffee. "My father was wrong," she said quietly. Elliot looked up. "He said I should only play when I had something worth hearing," she continued. "Last night, when we were playing for Luna, I realized there was no audience more worthy than her. Not a sold-out concert hall, not a panel of critics, just her." Elliot placed his hand over hers. "I ran from music because I was afraid it would hurt Luna," he confessed. "But I was wrong. Our music isn't hurting her. It's keeping her here." The simple truth resonated between them, not as a business concept, but as a truth of the heart. Music could heal. Leaving Lyra Records was not an overnight decision. It was a painful and complicated transition. Victoria faced criticism, looks of pity. On her last day, she stood alone in her office, looking down at the city she once thought she wanted to conquer. She didn't feel loss. She felt like she was coming home. The Luna Foundation wasn't launched with a splashy press conference. It started in a small rented office with a few old chairs and a donated piano. Victoria, with her executive experience, handled the paperwork and fundraising. Elliot, with his artist's heart, built the programs. The story ends on a sunny Saturday afternoon, a year later. They are not in a lavish mansion, but in a small house with a garden. Luna, though still needing special care, is on a swing, her clear laughter echoing in the air. Victoria is sitting on the porch steps, a notebook in her lap. Elliot comes out of the house with 2 cups of tea. He sits beside her, and they watch Luna in shared silence. "The Foundation's first quarterly report," Victoria said, tapping the notebook. "We've helped 17 kids." Elliot wasn't looking at the numbers. He was looking at her. "We helped ourselves," he said. He set down his tea and took her hand. There were no wedding proposals, no diamond rings. There was only the quiet peace of 2 people who had found the true melody of their lives. The music was still there, not on grand stages, but in Luna's laughter, in the silent understanding between them, in the promise of a simple, whole tomorrow.